Daily readings for January 30th. Saint Martina, Virgin, Martyr. Saint Martina, a noble Roman virgin, suffered martyrdom during the persecution of Alexander Severus and under the pontificate of Urban I, about 228. Our first reading is from the second book of Samuel, chapter 18. David mourns Absalom. Absalom happened to run into some of David's followers. Absalom was riding a mule, and the mule passed under the thick branches of a great oak. Absalom's head caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between earth and heaven. While the mule he was riding went on, someone saw this and told Joab, "I have just seen Absalom," he said, "hanging from an oak." Joab took 3 lances in his hand and thrust them into Absalom's heart while he was still alive there in the oak tree. David was sitting between 2 gates. The lookout had gone up to the roof of the gate on the ramparts. He looked up and saw a man running all by himself. The watch called out to the king and told him. The king said, "If he is by himself, he has good news to tell." The king told the man, "Move aside and stand there." He moved aside and stood waiting. Then the Cushite arrived. "Good news for my lord the king," cried the Cushite. "The Lord has vindicated your cause today by ridding you of all who rebelled against you." "Is all well with young Absalom?" the king asked the Cushite. "May the enemies of my lord the king," the Cushite answered, "and all who rebelled against you to your hurt, share the lot of that young man." The king shuddered. He went up to his room over the gate and burst into tears, and weeping said, "My son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, would I had died in your place. Absalom, my son, my son." Word was brought to Joab. The king is now weeping and mourning for Absalom. But the day's victory was turned to mourning for all the troops, because they learned that the king was grieving for his son, and the troops returned stealthily that day to the town, as the troops crept back ashamed when routed in battle. A reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. "Little girl, I tell you to get up." When Jesus had crossed in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered round him, and he stayed by the lakeside. Then one of the synagogue officials came up, Jairus by name, and seeing him, fell at his feet and pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is desperately sick. Do come and lay your hands on her to make her better and save her life." Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him. They were pressing all around him. Now there was a woman who had suffered from hemorrhaging for 12 years. After long and painful treatments under various doctors, she spent all she had without being any better for it. In fact, she was getting worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his cloak. "If I can touch even his clothes," she had told herself, "I shall be well again." And the source of the bleeding dried up instantly, and she felt in herself that she was cured of her complaint. Immediately aware that power had gone out from him, Jesus turned round in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see how the crowd is pressing round you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he continued to look all around to see who had done it. Then the woman came forward, frightened and trembling, because she knew what had happened to her, and she fell at his feet and told him the whole truth. "My daughter," he said, "your faith has restored you to health. Go in peace and be free from your complaints." While he was still speaking, some people arrived from the house of the synagogue officials to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why put the master to any further trouble?" But Jesus had overheard this remark of theirs, and he said to the official, "Do not be afraid, only have faith." And he allowed no one to go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So they came to the official's house, and Jesus noticed all the commotion, with people weeping and wailing unrestrainedly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and crying? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. So he turned them all out, taking with him the child's father and mother and his own companions. He went into the place where the child lay, and taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I tell you, get up." The little girl got up at once and began to walk about, for she was 12 years old. At this time they were overcome with astonishment, and he ordered them strictly not to let anyone know about it, and told them to give her something to eat. Praise be to you, O Lord Jesus Christ.